Ink was still drying on the paperwork when my son called to say congratulations. 41 years. That's how long I ran Ashworth Logistics. Started it in a rented garage in Columbus, Ohio, with 2 trucks, a folding table, and a phone I shared with my wife. By the time I signed the final transfer documents that Tuesday morning in March, it was a regional freight company with contracts across 12 states and a sale price of $47 million. The attorney slid the folder across the conference table, and I just sat there for a second, looking at my own signature, thinking about my wife Carol, and how she never got to see this day. She passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and cruel. I'd kept the company going partly because I didn't know what else to do with myself without her. My son. I'll call him my son, because that's what he was to me for 34 years, even if the last chapter of this story makes that word feel strange in my mouth. Called at 11:15. His name is Kevin. He was warm, genuinely warm. Said all the right things. Said he was proud of me. Said Carol would have been proud. I had to look out the window for a moment so the attorney wouldn't see my eyes get wet. Dad, we have to celebrate. Let me take you to dinner, somewhere nice. Anywhere you want. I said sure. I meant it. Kevin was my only child, and his wife Diane had been part of our family for 11 years. They had a daughter together, my granddaughter Rosie, who was 7 and thought I hung the moon. Dinner sounded good. Dinner sounded like exactly what I needed. I should have noticed things earlier. Looking back, I can trace the line clearly, the way you can only trace something after it's already cut you. But that's the problem with trust. It doesn't leave room for suspicion, and I'd spent 34 years trusting Kevin the way you trust the ground under your feet. He chose the restaurant. A place called Hargrove's on the north side of Columbus, white tablecloths. A sommelier who treated wine like it was scripture, the kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices because the assumption is you already know you can afford it. I'd been there once before, years ago for a client dinner. Kevin made the reservation for 7 o'clock. Just the 3 of us, me, him, and Diane. I wore the blue jacket Carol had bought me for her anniversary dinner 2 years before she got sick. I don't know why I put it on that night. Some instinct, maybe. Like I wanted her close. Diane was already at the table when I arrived. She hugged me, said I looked wonderful, poured water from the carafe. Kevin came back from the restroom a minute later, shook my hand, pulled me into one of those half hugs men do when they're not sure how much warmth is appropriate. We ordered drinks. Kevin chose a bottle of Cabernet, described it to the sommelier with a vocabulary I didn't know he had. The evening started the way these things do. Stories, laughter, the waiter bringing bread. Kevin wanted to know what I planned to do with the time. Travel, I said. Maybe buy a small place in Asheville. Carol had always wanted to retire in the mountains. You should also think about your estate structure, Diane said, and something about her tone, not unfriendly, almost casual, lodged in my mind the way a splinter does, small enough to ignore. With a liquidity event this size, the tax exposure is significant. You want to make sure everything's set up correctly going forward. I told her I had an attorney and a financial advisor who'd already been in touch. Kevin nodded. Of course. But Diane knows this stuff, Dad. Her background in wealth management. I excused myself to take a call from my attorney. There was a final detail about wire confirmation that needed my verbal approval. I walked toward the bar area, near the back of the restaurant, and I was on the phone maybe 4 minutes. Maybe 5. When I came back, I stopped just short of the table. Our waiter, a young man I'd noticed earlier because of how quietly efficient he was, the kind of server who refills your water without being asked, was standing a few feet away, near the service alcove. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at our table, and there was something in his posture, some tension in the way he was standing absolutely still, that made me stop. He saw me. Glanced toward Kevin and Diane, then back to me. He walked over calmly, the way a person walks when they're trying not to cause a scene, and he said very quietly, "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you. But while you were on your call, I saw your daughter-in-law add something to your wine glass. I don't know what it was. I thought you should know." I looked at him for a moment. He held my gaze. His hands were steady, his expression serious. No trace of drama in it. Just a man telling another man something true, because it was the right thing to do. I said, "Are you certain?" He said, "Yes, sir. I wouldn't say it if I wasn't. I thanked him. I walked back to the table. I sat down. I laughed at something Kevin was saying. I picked up my wine glass, turned it slightly, moved it toward the center of the table while reaching for the breadbasket. In the process, clumsily, the way tired older men sometimes are clumsy, I knocked the glass. Wine spilled on the tablecloth. I apologized, grabbed my napkin. In the small, brief chaos of that moment, I switched my glass with Diane's. This is the part I've replayed 1,000 times, not with satisfaction, with grief. Because even as I did it, some part of me was still hoping the young man was wrong, still hoping there was another explanation, still hoping I was about to feel foolish for suspecting my daughter-in-law, and that later I'd look back on this as the night I let paranoia get the better of me. Diane drank her wine. Kevin ordered another bottle. 40 minutes later, Diane's face went pale. She pressed her hand flat on the table. Kevin noticed immediately. Too immediately, I thought, the way a person notices something they're already waiting for. Diane, what's wrong? She said she felt strange, dizzy. Her words started slurring. Kevin stood up. I need to call a doctor. He pulled out his phone. I said very calmly, sit down, Kevin. Something in my voice stopped him. He looked at me. Sit down, I said again. The restaurant manager was already approaching. I asked him quietly to call 911. Within 10 minutes, 2 paramedics were at the table, and Diane was on a stretcher, barely conscious. Kevin was talking fast, saying it must have been an allergic reaction, saying she had a sensitivity to shellfish. The paramedics were professional and fast. I rode in the ambulance. Kevin followed in his car. At the ER, while Kevin was filling out paperwork at the desk, I found the attending physician, a man named Dr. Okafor, who had the particular calm of someone who'd seen everything twice. I told him what I'd seen, what the waiter told me. I told him about the glass switch. I asked him to run a full talk screen. He looked at me for a moment with that evaluating look doctors have, and then he nodded once and went back through the doors. I sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room and stared at the floor for a long time. Kevin came and sat next to me. Dad, I'm sure she's going to be fine. You know how these things. Kevin, I said, stop. He stopped. I looked at my son, at the face I'd watched grow from a baby's face to a man's, the face I'd seen at Little League games and high school graduation and at the altar when he married Diane. And I said, why? He didn't ask me what I meant. That told me everything. He said, Dad, you don't know what you're talking about. I said, I switched the glasses, Kevin. Whatever was in my wine, Diane drank it. And I've already told the doctor. The color left his face. I'd built a company from a rented garage. I'd signed contracts, navigated recessions, managed employees, sat across from hostile attorneys and corporate buyers who wanted to take what I'd built for less than it was worth. I'd buried my wife. I knew what I was talking about, and I knew in that moment exactly what had been planned. The talk screen came back. Midazolam M. A benzodiazepine. Sedative, fast-acting, the kind of drug that would have had me unconscious at the table inside of 20 minutes. Compliant. Confused. Possibly agreeable to documents I wouldn't remember signing. Dr. Okafor came out and spoke to me privately first, then notified the hospital's security officer, who called the police. Kevin was still in the waiting room when 2 officers came through the sliding glass doors. I learned the rest piece by piece over the following weeks as the investigation moved forward. Kevin had retained a separate financial advisor, someone Diane had found through a contact I didn't know, 6 weeks before the sale of the company closed. That advisor had prepared documents, a power of attorney, structured so that if I became temporarily incapacitated, Kevin would have authority over decisions related to the sale proceeds. The plan, as best as investigators reconstructed it, was straightforward and ugly. Drug me at dinner, get me to sign or sign on my behalf a series of investment transfers that would have moved a significant portion of the $47 million into accounts Kevin and Diane controlled. By the time I recovered, the transfers would have been processed. The complexity of the financial instruments involved would have made unwinding them difficult. It wasn't impulsive, it was planned over months. The thing I kept returning to in the nights that followed, and there were many of them, long and sleepless and heavy in a way I hadn't felt since Carol died, was not the money. The money would have been recovered, mostly. My attorney was confident about that. What I kept returning to was the Tuesday before the dinner, when Kevin had called to say congratulations. How warm his voice had been. How genuine it sounded. He was already planning it then. I thought about all the times over the years when I'd wondered if I was being too demanding, too slow to hand over responsibility, too reluctant to let go. I'd carried guilt about that. I'd told myself I should trust Kevin more, include him more, let him step into the business more fully. I'd been moving in that direction. I'd been getting there. Grief is strange. It doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like sitting very still in a hospital parking lot at 2 a.m. with the engine off, not ready to go home yet. Diane was treated and released the following afternoon. The sedative dosage apparently was not high enough to cause serious harm. At full dose in someone my size, it would have been different. She retained an attorney and cooperated with investigators in exchange for consideration on the charges. Kevin retained a separate attorney and initially contested everything. The recordings from the restaurant's security system, combined with the tox screen and the financial documents investigators recovered, made contesting anything fairly pointless. Kevin pled guilty in September. Fraud, conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. That's what Ohio calls it when someone targets a person over 60. He was sentenced to 4 years in order to pay restitution. I wasn't in the courtroom when he was sentenced. I didn't think I could sit there without falling apart, and I didn't want to fall apart in front of strangers. My granddaughter Rosie is 8 now. She lives with Diane's parents in Dayton, which is where Diane returned after everything happened. I've been careful about what contact looks like for Rosie. She shouldn't lose her grandfather over what her parents did. We video call on Sundays. She shows me drawings. Last week she drew a picture of a horse and told me his name was Butterscotch. I told her he was the finest horse I'd ever seen. The young man in Hargroves. His name is Thomas. I found out later he'd been working there for 2 years while finishing a degree in hospitality management at Columbus State. I went back to the restaurant 3 weeks after everything happened and asked for him specifically. He came out to the bar area where I was waiting, still in his uniform, clearly uncertain what to expect. I shook his hand. I told him what he'd done. I told him that I calculated, as precisely as I could, the financial harm he'd prevented, and I handed him an envelope. He tried to give it back. He said he'd just done what anyone would do. I told him that was not true, and that I'd heard enough polite refusals in 41 years of business to know when someone had made up their mind. I asked him to take it. He thanked me. We shook hands again. He had the handshake of someone who knew how to look a person in the eye. I've thought about Thomas often since then. About the particular kind of courage it takes to walk up to a stranger, a customer, an older man you don't know, and say what you saw, when saying nothing would have been so much easier. No one would have known. He had nothing to gain. He just saw something wrong and decided it was his problem to fix. That's rarer than money. I bought the house in Asheville in January. 2 bedrooms, a back porch that looks east toward the Blue Ridge, a kitchen big enough for Sunday dinners. I've been learning to cook the kinds of things Carol used to make. The biscuits aren't right yet. I'll keep working on them. Some mornings I sit on that porch with coffee and I think about the 41 years, all of it, the garage, the first trucks, the recession years when I wasn't sure we'd make it, the growth, the sale. I think about Carol. I think about the version of retirement I'd imagined, the one that included Kevin and Rosie and Sunday dinners that looked like a family. That version isn't available anymore. What's available is the version I'm building now, which is smaller in some ways and quieter, but also, and I mean this, though I couldn't have said it in those first weeks, honest. Everything in it is real. Everything in it chose to be there. That's worth more than I used to think. Rosie is coming to visit in June. She wants to see the mountains. I've already planned 3 things she'll love and saved 1 surprise for the second day. Because that's how Carol always did it. You give them something to look forward to after they think the best part is over. I still have a lot to figure out, But I'm 63 years old, I'm standing in a house I earned, and the man who tried to take it from me is where he belongs. That's enough for today. I keep coming back to something Thomas said when I tried to thank him. That he'd just done what anyone would do. I've thought about that line more than almost anything else from that night. Because I don't think it's true. I think most people would have looked away. I think most people would have told themselves it wasn't their business, that they probably misread the situation, that the risk of being wrong wasn't worth the awkwardness of speaking up. Thomas didn't do that. He made a choice. A small, quiet, costly choice in the space of a few seconds, with nothing to gain and everything to lose if he was wrong. That's not what anyone would do. That's what a person of genuine character does. And Kevin, my son, my only child, the boy I raised, made the opposite choice. He had months to change course. Months of planning, of conversations with Diane, of preparing documents and finding contacts and making reservations and picking a bottle of wine. Every single day of those months was a day he could have stopped. The fact that he didn't isn't just about greed. It's about what happens when a person stops exercising the muscle of their own conscience. It atrophies, and when the moment of real consequence arrives, there's nothing left to push back against the worst version of yourself. I'm not angry at Kevin in the way I expected to be. What I feel is closer to sorrow. Because I watched him grow up, I know he wasn't always this. Something in him. The discipline to stay honest when honesty is hard, the wisdom to understand that what you take by force or deception is never really yours. Something in him failed to hold. I don't know exactly when. I wish I did. What I do know is that the $47 million was never the point. I built Ashworth Logistics because I had something to prove to myself. Because I wanted to build something that lasted, because working hard at something real was how I made sense of my days. Carol understood that. She never needed the money to feel safe. She needed to see me doing work that mattered. And when I lost her, the company was what kept me upright. The money was a byproduct. It was never the foundation. Kevin mistook the byproduct for the foundation. That's a failure of understanding, of real intelligence, not the kind you measure with a test, but the kind that lets you see what actually holds a life together. He thought that if he had the money, he'd have the stability. He didn't understand that the stability came from somewhere else entirely, from the years of work, from choices made correctly when no one was watching. I think about that when I sit on the back porch in Asheville now. The mountains don't change. The light does, the season does, but the ridgeline holds. I've tried to be like that, to stay oriented toward what's real, to not let grief or bitterness or the weight of what happened bend me into something I wouldn't recognize. Some mornings, it's harder than others. But I get up. I make the coffee. I call Rosie on Sundays and listen to her tell me about butterscotch. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. Thomas is finishing his degree this spring. I hope he knows, I hope he carries with him, that what he did at that restaurant will matter longer than he realizes. Not because of me. Because of the kind of man it tells him he is.